Judge, thank you so much for joining us today on our series, Your Honor. As we've talked about, the Florida Bar has set up this program, and I'm hosting these interviews to talk to wise people that have seen the breadth of the profession and can share their thoughts and wisdom with us. So we're very grateful that you've taken the time to be here with us.
Well, Paul, I'm the one that's grateful because I appreciate the opportunity to do this. I don't know how wise I'm going to be, but I've been around for about 82 years, so at least I've seen a lot of things and maybe have something to add to the discussion about professionalism. And one of the reasons I'm grateful is because I love having the opportunity to talk to lawyers about our profession and particularly the subject of professionalism. So thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Judge, I want to start this way, if we could. Just some background. Can you let us know where you went to high school, college, and law school? Give us a little bit of that.
Sure. I came down with my family in 1950. I grew up in northern Kentucky, just outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. I went to Coral Gables High School, which I thought was, and still think, one of the most fortuitous things that ever happened to me. My family did not talk education. The idea of going to college, was never mentioned, much less even considered. But I was fortunate enough to go to one of the premier schools in the country. Back in the mid-50s, Coral Gables High School was officially ranked one of the top 10 public schools in the country. And so while I didn't get a lot of encouragement to go to college or education from home, my peers and the Pierce family were a great influence on me. In that regard, I'm kind of the opposite of Bob Josephsberg. When I was not a very good student for a long time. Like I say, it was not a point of emphasis for my family. But my friends, my peers, and people I went to high school with were good students. And they were starting to talk about college. I said, oh, what's that all about? And so that got me thinking about college and really encouraged me to go to college. And I put myself through college, 100% myself, worked my way through college. I started out at the University of Cincinnati. And the reason I chose Cincinnati is, as I say, I was putting myself through school, and that was the one place I thought I could afford to go because I could live with my grandmother. A wild and crazy freshman living in a room in grandmother's house, going to the University of Cincinnati. I didn't work out at Cincinnati because I ran out of money after my first semester, even though I worked at place called Kroger's Supermarket. It's a big chain, mainly up, I guess, in the north and the Ohio area. I was a bag boy and a stock boy after classes and on the weekends, but I still ran out of money. Came back to Miami. I worked until I entered into the University of Florida in September, the following September. So I'd got enough money together, so it put me through the first year at the University of Florida, which was probably one of the best things that ever happened to me. Another one of those fortuitous events. The fact that I came back to Florida, went to the University of Florida, was a much better route to take than having stayed at the University of Cincinnati. And then I had planned to become a teacher. I'd say that was, to me, the highest role anybody could have, and something I thought was within my capability and reach. Matter of fact, I even started on a master's degree while undergraduate. I had a Ford Fellowship. And as I got probably midway through my senior year at Florida, I thought, if I go get a master's degree and even potentially a PhD in history, what if I don't like teaching history? And some of my fraternity brothers had gone to law school or were going to law school at the University of Florida. I said, well, I'm not sure what that's all about, but I'll give that a try. So I applied to the University of Florida Law School. And at that time, University of Florida was pretty much taking anybody who could graduate from undergraduate school in there. A lot of people flunked out, but they were very democratic in the process of letting people come in and work through it. So that's how I got to the University of Florida. I'm not one of those stories where I said, ever since I was a little kid, I knew a bunch of lawyers and I wanted to be a lawyer and I saw Perry Mason. That's what I wanted to do in my life. No, that was not I kind of backed into it. Again, another one of those fortuitous, serendipitous events in my life. I'm very fortunate. I feel so blessed to be able to have tried cases for 36, 37 years as a trial lawyer, and then be on the bench for 22 years. So I'm very fortunate.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that. When you got out of law school, Did you come down to Miami right away, or did you practice in other parts of the state?
No, I came back to Miami. It's kind of interesting. I have lived in Miami since law school, and I've lived probably within a mile radius of Coral Gables High School. So you can say I haven't gotten very far in life, but I'm very comfortable here. I came and I worked. My first job was with a small, very, very prominent, excellent civil trial practice firm, Frates, Fay, and Floyd. And we'll probably be talking a little bit about both Bill Frates and, more importantly, Peter T. Fay, who is, hopefully the listeners know, was just one of the best trial lawyers ever in the state of Florida, and then became a district court judge here, became one of the best trial judges in the state of Florida, and then ended up on the 11th Circuit and unfortunately passed away a year and a half ago. But he was a role model and a mentor and a real dear friend. But he was one of my first bosses, together with Bill Frates, who was a legendary trial lawyer.
Well, Judge, I was going to ask you about that. I know that there are certain people that you turn to either as mentors or as role models. Some even become heroic to us in our journey. I know Judge Fay, I'm sure there were others. Can you share with the audience who these people were that helped shape you or your ideas, and why that should be important to us also?
Yeah, everybody should have mentors, role models. I mean, that's just the way you grow in your life and in your profession. I consider myself extremely fortunate to have many, but three stand out. I remember at my investiture, I was putting my thoughts together to make my comments, and it occurred to me that prior to going through the process of applying for and then going through the vetting process of becoming a district judge, I never really thought about who my heroes were. And that's one of the classic questions they ask you. Well, Mr. Paul Huck, who are your heroes? It's not people who hit 60 home runs or scored touchdowns. I thought about it long and hard and came to realize I had four people that I really consider to be heroes. And one was Bill Frates, another was Peter T. Fay, and the other was William Hoovler, and the third was my wife, who is really a hero of mine. And I was fortunate to have three of those four at my investiture. Judge Fay swore me in. I mean, I was so emotionally moved, I could hardly get the words out. To have somebody who I thought so highly of actually swear me in as a district judge. And Judge Hoovler gave the invocation. And I know you know both of them, and you understand what they were like. Unfortunately, not every single lawyer in the state of Florida had the opportunity to engage in and get to know Bill Hoovler, Peter T. Fay, and Bill Frates. Frates, totally different than the other two. He was really one of the premier trial lawyers probably in the country. He was a bit of a bulldog in the courtroom, but he had a heart outside the courtroom as big as all outdoors. Just a wonderful, wonderful man. And he was an influence on me because he was a tough taskmaster as a senior partner in the firm. And sometimes you would get bloodied because he would put you under this cross-examination, which was his forte. But he would cross-examine us young lawyers. We'd say, I've got an issue here, or here's what this case, about. And then he would pin you down. Well, who's the judge? He'd take pictures of the scene. What's the deposition like? What are the issues? He would grill you at this. And, it was very intimidating. Then I came to realize that Bill Frates did not expect us to be the best lawyers in South Florida, but he expected us and demanded of us that we be the best lawyers that we could be. And I learned that from him. And just a wonderful, wonderful man. And I miss him dearly. He Fay, totally the opposite, totally different personality.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Judge Fay and Judge Hoovler. What were their qualities that touched you and helped you grow?
Well, I've written and spoken about both these heroes, and they really are true heroes of mine. They are the only two human beings to men outside my family who ever said, I actually love them. I told them I love them because they were such a positive influence on me. And I owe so much to them, not because they did any deeds for me, but because they were who they were. And I was able to be around them and learn from them from just being around them. I'm not anything special about that. There are literally hundreds, maybe thousands of people who consider Bill Hoover and Peter T. Fay as their heroes, their mentors, their role models. I'm not unique in that respect. Well, first of all, each of them was a extremely, extremely good trial lawyer. Pete Fay mainly on the plaintiff side, not entirely, but mainly on the plaintiff side. Bill Hoover always on the defense side. Did a lot of professional malpractice and was just an excellent, excellent trial lawyer. And they were really, really good. I mean, people would come to the courthouse to watch them try cases. But unlike Bill Freites, you could never call either of them a bulldog in the courtroom. When you talk about civility, Exhibit A and B would be Bill Hoover, Pete Fay, or vice versa. They were so gracious and so welcoming to you that you just had to love the two of them. But they were so effective. But I think the thing that sets them out to me, I've always felt this way about them, and they were so good at what they did. They were just so competent. And yet they were so actually, honestly humble. They were confident, but not the slightest hint of arrogance. They were always thinking about you. It was never about them. And they're just very special human beings. Besides being great trial lawyers, great trial judges, they were really, really extraordinarily great human beings. And that's what I think makes them role models, at least for me, and why I love both of them so much.
You also mentioned that one of your heroes is your wife, and I want to stop on that for a second and ask you this. I've often said in talks that I've given that the great teams that you put together and the success you have begins at home. The quality of your marriage, the quality of your spouse, your relationship at home. Can you just share, without going into any too personal things, why your wife is a hero to you?
Well, we'll get to this later. I try to break this professionalism discussion into three categories or three themes, one of which is competence. The next would be civility, which is probably the one most often comes to people's mind. The other is contribution and contentment. And
right.
My wife, Donna, really hits the nail on the head with both of those last two, contribution and contentment. I was, when I first came out of law school, I was relatively active in the bar activities. I was in the Board of Governors, both the local and the state, the young lawyers, and spoke at high schools and did some things like that. But then, I don't know why it changed, but then I got to the point where I became almost a workaholic. The only focus I had was the case I had, the case I'm going to have, work and work and work. And I realized there was something missing in my life. And it was a long time coming, quite frankly, maybe 25, 30 years ago. I realized there was something missing in my life. And I looked around at those people who I really admired. And the people who looked like they really were enjoying their lives, and many of them were lawyers. I said, well, what do they have that I don't have? And I came to the conclusion, what they had that I didn't have was they were giving of themselves to others in the most honest, giving way you can. Not because they want to get a new client, develop business, or get an award or an accolade. They did it for the right reasons, because it was the right thing to do. And in a speech I gave, I guess about 15 years ago, I identified four of those people. People who I looked around and said, these are people who I really should follow their lead. One was Bob Josephberg, who just recently gave an interview. One was John Kozak, who's a partner of mine when I went on the bench. My son, who I'm sure he was shocked to hear me say this in public, and my wife, Donna. And what they do, and what Donna particularly does, is she gives of herself, charitable work with friends. She is just such a giving person, but always for the right reason. I've been in situations where she has been in charge of something. She was very involved in Miami Children's Hospital, for example. She was chairman of the board when I first met her, was on the board for 20, 25 years, and several other boards and things like that. And I can recall events where I knew she's the one that put it together, or she's the one that did all the work, and someone else would be getting the accolade. And I can recall on a number of occasions saying, Donna, wait a minute, you should be getting the award, or you should be getting the accolade, or they should be saying. And she always said, no, I don't need that. It's not, it's not why she did things. And I've always admired that so much in her. And so many people do things, but for the wrong reason. She does things for the right reason, as does Joseph Berg, my son, and John Kozak. I think that's what sets people apart.
That's great.
They do great work, good work,
that's
for the right reason. And we can talk about that a little bit later on, because and listening to Bob Joseph Berg.
Right. I want to ask you about this. The topic, the title of this interview and this section is professionalism. And then we have what you mentioned before, the 4 C's: competency, civility, contribution, and contentment. Before we get into those specifically, I have a couple of other just general questions for you.
Okay.
As a federal judge, what did you and what do you expect of yourself in the system of justice as a federal judge? What are you looking for when you take the bench? What are you seeking?
Well, this might be a little disappointing here. I don't have a great philosophy about the law. I look at it this way, and that's just what I tell my law clerks when I interview them and what I expect of them to help me do. And my expectation of myself is to make decisions, think about it, make the right decision, make it in a timely fashion, and explain to the person or the parties involved why I reached that decision. They're entitled to know why. If I rule against them, they're entitled to know why I ruled against them. That's pretty basic stuff. It's meat and potatoes, so to speak. But that's what I think my job is. I'm not up there in the stratosphere determining great constitutional issues, even though from time to time I will get kind of a nice little issue, constitutional issue, something like that. But that's not my day in, day out type of work. I think what I owe to the litigants and to the lawyers is the best trial I can give them, the best decisions I can give them in a timely fashion, and to be fair and hopefully to be impartial. And we all bring our backgrounds to the bench, but we have to be constantly aware of the fact that we do have these biases. We all have biases. We've got to continually fight against letting those biases come into our decisions. Not as easy as it might sound, but it's a very important aspect of it. And probably one of the areas where I might come up a little short is, give them as civil and as pleasant an experience as possible in an adversarial situation. I have to admit sometimes I have not been as accommodating or maybe as civil as I should have been. And I'll tell you, when I realize that, I always feel badly about it. I mean, just like when I was practicing law, I try to be civil, and I think in most respects I succeeded. But every once in a while, I'm pretty sure, as a matter of fact, I know I crossed the line, became less civil than I should have been. But one thing I will say, I always regretted it. There was never a time where I thought I was out of line, but I didn't think back and say, I really dropped the ball and felt very badly about it. And more often than not, I would have to go over to my opponent, apologize to him, and shake his or her hand, and then hopefully proceed from there. So that's what I think of my job as a judge.
Well, you raised that issue of that sweet spot between the lawyers before you being a tough advocate and also being an officer of the court. How do you see that when the lawyers are in front of you? How do you deal with keeping them in that sweet spot so that they don't cross the line and bad things start to happen in a trial or in the courtroom?
Well, I'm not sure how you define or can actually describe what the sweet spot is, but as one justice of the Supreme Court said, you can tell it when you see it. I think I run a pretty tight ship. I think I do. I'm strict with following the protocol. If we have local rules, we have pretrial orders, I expect them to comply with that. And I get a little frustrated sometimes when, not because they are not smart enough, it's because they're not diligent enough or prepared enough. That's what bothers me. When I see lawyers go at each other, I have a fairly straightforward process. Sometimes you can see it when they walk into the courtroom. First time you've seen the two lawyers, maybe on a motion to dismiss or summary judgment. And by the way, as a federal judge, I happen to like oral arguments in person or by Zoom if necessary. But you can see them looking at each other with daggers. And if I see that, I'll be sensitive to it. And more often than not, when I see that, when it's gotten to the point where they really can't communicate with each other, and it's making my job more difficult and making their lives much more miserable, I'll stop them and I'll lecture them. I'll say, look, we've got a wonderful profession. We're blessed to be able to practice law. It's a privilege. It's not a right, but it's very demanding. The practice of law is a wonderful practice or profession, but it's very demanding. And don't make your lives any more difficult by being difficult between the two of you. And if that doesn't persuade you, then I don't want you to make my life more difficult. And if they don't get that message, then I'm not sure what else I can do. In federal court, I don't find we have a lot of problems that surface in the courtroom itself. The problems tend to be outside the courtroom. Sometimes when it appears in the courtroom, what I'll do is I've sent lawyers outside the hallway to think about their approach to this case. I say, before you come back in, I expect you to shake hands. And when you come back in, we're going to start with a clean slate. And sometimes they come back and they believe me when I say a clean slate. And sometimes they want to start right back in. And I say, I use this, time out. We're not going down that route. And you know what? I think for the most part, lawyers want to do the right thing. I'm not a basher of lawyers. I love lawyers. I love the profession. I love my 36, 37 years of being a trial lawyer. I love being on the bench trying cases with lawyers. I think it's by far the best profession. And the kind of people who are drawn to the profession to become lawyers are people I kind of like. They're interesting. They're smart. I think they're good people. Throughout our history, they've done the good things that, kind of basis of our Constitution, lawyers. Every great event in our history, lawyers are there to lead the way. So I like lawyers. One of my shortcomings, if you would call it a shortcoming, is because I feel this way about the lawyers. I really do. And maybe this is something I've gained as I've gotten older, but I really, really think it's a wonderful profession. But my expectation level is so high that I'm very demanding and very strict. I expect people to meet that standard. And when they don't meet that standard, I might be a little tough on them. But on the other hand, I remember when I was a lawyer, the most frustrating thing I found dealing with judges were those who weren't strict enough, who didn't require everybody to comply with the rules, who didn't require everybody to show up in time, who didn't require everybody to act in a civil way and let them get away with specious arguments or personal attack type of arguments like that. That used to frustrate me as a lawyer. I never thought that was the way to do it. And so I think one of our jobs as judges is to set the example. For example, I can recall in court, and usually, I hate to say it, but usually it was in state court because they've got, and I've got an excuse for them, or at least a reason why. They have so much more on their plates than we do in federal court. But I can recall coming into court for a 9 o'clock hearing, 9:15, 9:30, and the judge would come breezing through. Of course, everything was kind of through the public thoroughfare. See the judge go back to chambers, 9:45, 10 o'clock, and maybe 10 o'clock, the judge would show up. And that set such a bad example that then the lawyers would kind of say, okay, well, if that's the way the judge is going to do it. So I think one of our responsibilities is to set the tone, to set the example for all the lawyers. Because if we can't operate properly, if we don't show up in time, if we're not prepared, then how can we expect the lawyers to be prepared? So I think that's a very, very critical aspect of our job as judges. And I don't know if I succeeded, but I've always kept that in mind as a former trial lawyer, that this is what bothered me as a trial lawyer, and I don't want to have this said about me, or I felt I owe this to the trial lawyers to give them the best judging I can give to them, which included, following my rules, being on time, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not sure I answered your question.
You did, and it leads me to another question. as a trial lawyer, you tried cases in state and federal court, and you were a very successful trial lawyer. I guess the question I have initially is, in state court, as you said, the judges, there's so much, the caseload is massive. And you and I talked a couple of days ago about the concept of, has process overtaken purpose? Getting through the cases, moving the cases along, versus seeking the justice in each case. I want to get your thoughts about how the judge has to balance that. They have to close a certain number of cases, whether it's in state or federal court, and yet making certain that everyone has their day. Can you address that? Your thoughts on that, Judge?
Well, I think it's a little different, federal versus state court. In the federal court, we have such great resources. I have 3 law clerks. I'm a senior judge. I have fewer cases of my own, even though I try cases for the judges, but I have fewer cases than even a federal judge, an active federal judge. I've got a lot of help. I look over at my brethren over in state court. I see that they have a lot more challenges because just the enormity of their caseload. And I think that, what you say, the process may be overwhelming. The results that you want to obtain. Everybody's entitled to a fair trial, fair hearing. I think that affects all judges to some extent, some more than others. And I think to me, it's just a matter of organizing your time, organizing your caseload, organize your day. Because I don't think any judge is so overwhelmed that they can't do it. It's just a matter of evaluating the challenge and saying, okay, what's the best way to meet that challenge? It's not for me to criticize or to be an apologist for state or federal judges. Every judge has his or own way of doing things. But I do think there is a lot of pressure, particularly on state court judges because of their limited resources, to move the cases along. There's something, state court, they permit the state court judges, I understand this by hearsay, so take it for what it's worth. I've never tried a criminal case. Matter of fact, I'd never seen a criminal case before I went on the bench. But I hear, that the judges in state court get involved in plea negotiations. Well, that is completely outlawed in federal court. You can't even think about it, much less talk about it. And I think that's right. I do not. My own personal view is judges should stay out of settlements discussions. Judges should stay out of plea bargaining. That's not for us. I think that's for the lawyers. And if you have a mediator, fine. But judges are to stay neutral, and one of the ways you stay neutral is to hear the facts, hear the evidence, and make decisions, not upon whether someone settles or is being unreasonable in the settlement conference. So, I'd rather leave that question to maybe somebody who's got more of a challenge than I do currently. But I'll tell you what I have seen, though. When I first started practicing in 1965, I don't recall how many judges we had, state judges, but there couldn't have been 10. And they were more like federal judges today. The caseloads weren't as heavy. They had more time, it seemed to me, to contemplate some of these issues, and didn't seem they had a frenetic pace to go through. And as time went by, from 65 through, I guess, 22 years ago when I went on the bench, I could see things were changing. First of all, we had far more judges, so things became much less personal. We didn't, the lawyers and the judges didn't know each other as well as they did back in 1965, when it was still a relatively small bar here in Dade County and a relatively bench here in Dade County. I think we only had 2 federal judges when I first started practicing. And I think that's had an impact on it too. The fact that we don't have the same personal engagement that we had before. Growing old has some disadvantages, you well know. When I get up in the morning like this morning, I got up and back was a little aching more than it was when I was 22 years old. But we do have some benefits of growing old. And one of them is your perspective changes in life. And probably one of the biggest changes in my life about perspective of what life's about is, maybe I knew this, but only subconsciously back when I was a young lawyer. But today it's right up there in front. It's all about relationships, personal relationships. And going back to your comment earlier about the family, it starts at home. To me, that's the foundation. If that's solid, then everything else builds on that. But, I look back now, I'm in the twilight of my years, clearly. And I'm thinking about what are the things today that mean so much to me that maybe didn't mean so much, when I was trying to build a practice and get my kids through school and college and pay the mortgage and all those kind of things. It's all about relationships. It really is. And that's the most worthwhile thing you can have. It's worth more than any big verdict, any big house, any big car, anything.
I agree. I agree completely with you.
I always encourage people, and don't waste your relationships on people who are not good people, because there are lots of really, really good people. Learn from them, associate with them, get to know them, and your life is going to be full of them. I'm kind of waxing on it, as an 82-year-old person does, but this is so important to me now. It is so important to me now for me to realize that, and I wish I had realized this more when I was 22, 23, 30 years old.
Well, when you say that, I have some other questions I was going to ask before I get to this question, but let me ask this question now then. You and I talked about this earlier, and you've answered part of it now. If you were to write a letter to your younger self, what would you want your younger self to know that you've learned over time that you wish you learned earlier? I think you've just mentioned some of it now. Is there other things that you want to tell people? If you would tell yourself, listen, don't forget or remember, etc. What would that be, Judge?
Well, again, I would repeat what I just said. Relationships. Seek out those people who are good people, the people who you look to and you admire, and get to know them. Even if you become a pest, I would have seeked out more aggressively, maybe mentorships. Now, I think I have had good mentoring, kind of by osmosis, more than formal mentoring. I don't think mentoring back in the 60s, was as prominent an idea as it is today. But there was kind of this informal osmosis mentoring where Pete Fay, if you asked him, did you mentor Paul Huck? He would say, I don't think so. But he was a mentor to me by osmosis. He was. Same thing with Judge Hoover. I've known him, his daughters babysat for me when our kids were small. So that would be probably the number one thing, relationships. Reputation. Yeah. I've always, I think, and maybe I'm giving myself too much credit here, I always thought reputation was critical. A good reputation was so important. Next to your education and your innate intelligence and work ethic, your reputation is the most valuable tool you have as a trial lawyer, or as any kind of a lawyer, as any kind of a person.
Yeah, and in fact, I was just going to say the reputation also has ties to your credibility as a lawyer and a judge.
No question about it. Whenever a lawyer is at one of these luncheons or someplace where they have a give and take, excuse me, I'm move my chair around, have a give and take with judges, someone will always come up with, well, judges, we talk about you. And we judges respond by saying, we judges know you lawyers talk about us. But you want to know something? We judges talk about you. And let me give you an example. I mean, I think in these kind of discussions, sometimes it's helpful to give concrete examples rather than these broad brushed statements that, and I'll give you one. There was, we used to have these brown bag lunches, the judges, upstairs in the servery on the 14th floor of the federal courthouse. And we'd bring our brown bags and we'd sit around and talk about cases and issues that came up. And one day, I think there were about 5 or 6 of us sitting there having lunch. And in comes one of our colleagues. And he's frustrated. You could just tell. He comes in and says, these were his exact words, I am in the trial from hell. And he goes on to tell us about his trial. He said it was a wage case. And here in Florida, we have probably more wage. I know definitely more wage cases than any other district in the country. But anyway, I got a wage case. And I got the lawyer on the plaintiff side. He's so incompetent, I can't rely on anything he says. And the lawyer on the defendant's side, he's so devious, I can't rely on anything he said. And you want to know something? Every single one of us judges knew exactly who those two lawyers were without the judge telling us who they were. It is. Your reputation is there. And as it's funny. We haven't learned a lot over the last few thousand years. I am not a scholar of the Bible, but I do from time to time read the book of Proverbs. Because I think if you read and follow the book of Proverbs, you pretty much learn everything you need to know and learn about being a good person. And the one that I always love is that it goes something like, and I may not have this exactly right, a good reputation should be chosen rather than great riches. Mm-hmm. And that is so true. It's funny, I've lost some good friends recently. And we've talked, this happened in the last couple 2 or 3 weeks, talked about some lawyers we've known, including Pete Fay and a fellow named Henry Burnett, who was in that same category of really outstanding trial lawyers, but really outstanding professionals. And when we talk about these people, and we've talked about, and this happened just recently, we talked about, none of us talked about any of their wins, their verdicts, any money they earned. We talked only about what kind of person they were. Yeah. Okay. And I always think about, what would I like for somebody to read about me in my obituary? What would I like to hear someone say about me at my funeral? And I would be really disappointed if someone said, well, he was a pretty good lawyer. He represents some people. He got some verdicts. He had a nice house on University Drive, whatever. I would hope they would say, he was a good person. That, to me, that's key. I mean, there's nothing more valuable than that. And I don't understand how people can give up that for a short-term benefit of trying to game the system, try to do something that's unethical, something that's even, uncivil. I mean, that's how you're known by other people. And it's like, I play tennis. Played tennis this morning. The one thing that really frightens me is, line calls are sometimes very difficult to make. And it just bothers me by the fact that I may call a ball out that was inadvertently. Because I would hate for someone to say, don't ever play tennis with Paul Huck, because he won't give you a good call on the lines. Right. To me, that's just so important. And I don't understand why people don't understand that. And some people just could care less. But having said that, it's a very, very small minority of lawyers, in my opinion. We talk a lot about professionalism. And Mike Tanner, he's currently the president of the Florida Bar. Wonderful, wonderful lawyer and a wonderful president, I think. His thing is professionalism. It always has been. And now that he's president of the Florida Bar, that is his main issue. And I was reading an article that he wrote some months ago, I think, and I believe I got the statistics right. He said, in these surveys they send out to the bar members, he said fully 1/3 of those who responded, 1/3 said the most important problem or issue is lack of civility and lack of professionalism. Now, I agree that's a major issue, but it's a major issue for a very minor group of people. I just think most people, try to do and want to do the best things. Sometimes we all fall short. It may not come as a surprise to anybody. We're all human beings. Lawyers are all human beings, in spite of some of those funny lawyer jokes. So, anyway, that's...
No, and I appreciate that, Judge. I want to go on to some other issues before I come back to some of these. I wanted to get your thoughts on the impact of elections on state court judges. What are your thoughts about that? What's the pressures it brings to bear? And just want your thoughts on that.
All right. Well, I think in the spirit of full disclosure, I will give you my bias, first of all. I am adamantly opposed to elections of judicial officers. I think it undermines the judiciary. I really do. The very idea that a judge or a candidate for judgeship has to go out to the local service club or civic club or church group or whatever and basically beg for contributions is so demeaning of the position. And I think corrupts, to a certain extent, the position. I think with all its faults, and everything that's created by human beings has limitations and faults. But the pointing process through the governor's office is not perfect, but is so far superior, in my view, to the election. You just don't know how can a judicial officer or judicial candidate put forth anything other than his or her name, a bunch of billboards, a bunch of advertisements, maybe a word or sounding the name that sounds familiar or something like that. We're not supposed to and can't talk about the issues. And if they do talk about the issues, I would take this position against criminals or that or whatever it might be. That's inappropriate. But to answer your question, I think because of that, again, I'm speaking not for the state judges. I've never run for state court position, and I never would. Frankly, I would never get involved in that process. But they said, Paul, in order to be a judge, you've got to run for office. I just wouldn't do it. But I can't believe that there's not a lot of pressure on these human beings who have a position as judge or want to be judges, that they don't feel pressure to, well, maybe if I this little group, I'll do this, that. I want to look good. Cameras in the courtroom. I want to maybe play to the audience. There are all those temptations, and I sympathize with them. I don't know what the answer is, other than to do away with elections. Yeah, I think just my guess, because I don't know for a fact. I think it does affect. I don't know how it can.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's go to the other side of it with appointments or that process. Are you concerned that we've entered into a time in our society, our culture, where politics is getting in the way of the judicial system, that the judiciary is being affected by politics?
You want the long answer or the short answer? Executive summary or the long answer?
This is a really important question, and so I want you to take your time.
Yeah, I can say what I believe because I'm not going to be repercussions. I do believe that, but this is a reflection of society today in this country. The politics of judicial appointments is no different than the politics of government. Unfortunately, those of us who, at least we think we're in the middle of the road, the people who are willing to look at the other side's perspective and point of view and maybe compromise somewhere in the middle. I think we're probably a majority, but we're the silent majority, as we're termed. Now we have people on the extremes on both sides of the political spectrum that seem to control the dialogue. And then by controlling the dialogue, they contribute the money, they become the political workers. And that leaks into the judicial process. There's no question about it. Look at the confirmation hearings. And both sides are responsible for that. Neither side has the market on that. There's no monopoly. It's a sad state of affairs. I mean, I've always been very involved in. I've never been a politician, but I've always enjoyed the process of politics and reading a lot about it, watching all the news. I'm so disheartened by what's happened. I don't watch as much news. My wife and I, we don't sometimes because we feel like there's not a whole lot we can do about it anyway. So why put up with the angst, and the disappointment of what's happening today? And to answer your question, this is a long-winded way of getting around back to judges. I don't see how it cannot leak itself into the process of appointment. But it also leaks itself into the judicial elections, I think, to a certain extent.
Yeah, and so what are your suggestions for judges in state or federal court to insulate themselves as best they can from the pressures of politics and elections? I guess I'm asking, what do you expect from your fellow judges, men or women?
Yeah, that's kind of maybe not hard for me to say, but I'm not sure it's my place to say what others should do because I'm not in that process. I haven't been in the turmoil of elections. From the perspective of a federal appointment, I think the process works pretty well. Now, that's kind of self-aggrandizing myself because I'm a product of that. But I think trying to set aside any personal experience I may have, I think we do a pretty good job, at least historically. I think, a few wrinkles now and then, more recently maybe. But I think the people who are appointed to these judicial nominating commissions really, really want to do a good job and really, really want to pick the best people. I am convinced of that as much as I know I'm sitting here talking to you. I really believe that. Sometimes it gets off track a little bit when you get the people who are in politics, real politics. But I think the process of having a commission, the people selected, some from one side, some from the other, but from my experience, very prominent lawyers who have the goal in mind of making our judiciary better is the way to go. And they perform their responsibilities, I think, very, very well and very conscientiously. I've had situations where I have heard candid discussions, and I'm not sure they knew I was there. And when they talk about this, and I see how they talk about it, and they take their job so seriously, and they're making the decisions for the right reasons, that gives me such confidence in the commission. I have less confidence maybe when the process goes outside the commission. But and the reason and I think that reflects well on lawyers and the profession in general, because it's lawyers who are on those commissions for the most part. Right. And they care about who the judges are, because they know it's the lifeblood, or one of the lifebloods of our profession. It's how we sustain our rule of law, which is probably the most valuable asset this country has. Look around the world, and there are very few places that have I'll call it the wealth of our nation that is based upon the rule of law. And it's not oil like Russia or grain like Ukraine or gold. It's our rule of law. And I think lawyers generally, and for the most part, are really concerned about that. I want to make sure that they do their job, uphold their part of the bargain as lawyers and part of the profession, because we do have an obligation as officers of the court. That's not just a meaningless word. It means something. We have an obligation because we have certain benefits as lawyers. For example, we have the right to govern ourselves. We're the only ones who can practice law, right? But we have a corresponding obligation to make sure that we exercise those prerogatives or those privileges in the right way, to sustain the rule of law, to protect the constitutional rights of the individual, particularly those who can't protect themselves. And that is critical. And I think lawyers, for the most part, do a pretty good job. And that we don't think about it every day. I can't tell you I think about these great ideas every day. But I think deep down inside, I think most lawyers feel that that's an obligation we have as officers of the court, of protectors of the rule of law in this country. Because without the rule of law, this country would be like any other country. And it's not. It's really quite unique.
We've talked about these issues on the 4 C's throughout our interview: competency, civility, contribution, and contentment. Is there anything you would like to add as far as professionalism is concerned, and why those 4 C's are so important?
All right. There are a couple of points I think I'd like to make that maybe other people, when they talk about professionalism, don't make. And I want to talk about competency. And there's a reason that competency is the very first rule in the rules of professional responsibility. It's like you say, your family is the foundation of your personal relationships. Well, competency is the foundation of professionalism, in my view, and that's why it's the very first rule. And I think this leads, by not adhering to the standards of competency, lawyers get themselves into trouble. From my perspective, and one of the advantages of being a judge as opposed to being a trial lawyer and being in the fray and having a dog in the fight, so to speak, is I don't have a dog in the fight. I'm sitting up there and I'm watching case unfold. And I have seen over the years, including my years as a trial lawyer, but particularly as a judge where I can just sit and watch, that a lack of competency leads to cutting corners, not civil behavior, not being direct with the court, maybe taking on a case that you shouldn't take on because you're you need the income. I think it gives a lack of confidence in yourself, your ability to do things. So you feel you have to compensate by being a jerk, so to speak, to use the vernacular, uncivil. Because you can't do really good writing, you can't put out a good memo of law, you start making personal accusations that your case is nothing more than, and nothing less, just a bunch of personal attacks, exaggerations, misstating cases, misstating the facts, those kind of things. It just leads to a lot of shortcomings in the practice. Again, I think that's a minority, but it exists. And I think part of the problem, let me tell you what I think are the three basic principles of competency. The very first principle should be know what you don't know. Okay? Because if you don't know that you don't know something, you're not competent to do that, you're going to get into trouble. I can almost guarantee you that. And then don't do what you don't know. You know, some people say, I've never had this kind of case before, but I'll wing it. Well, today you can't do that. It's an age of specialty. When I first started practicing 1965, you could have a general civil practitioner. You could have a general practitioner of office matters. Not so much today. It seems like everybody is specialized, and the law has become more complex. In some respects, more demanding. We have more tools, Zoom and all this technology, but the law has become increasingly technical, becoming increasingly specific in terms of development of the law, and it creates problems. So don't do what you don't know. And I guess my third principle would be, if you do what you don't know, then get to know a really good lawyer who is competent in the area of bar grievance matters, because that's where you're going to end up. The reason I want to talk about contribution, I think it's a very important part of our job description as lawyers, and particularly as judges, but I think it's part of our job description, contributions. It's also part of our job description as human beings. But it's interesting, in watching Bob Josephberg's comments about, I would call it, let's say good deeds, whatever it might be, but good deeds. You're trying to do something that's not necessarily directly to your benefit, financially or practice-wise or whatever. And he had the same take on it that I did. As a matter of fact, I thought he somewhat stole my thunder because you get so much out of doing these kinds of things. It makes you a whole real person. And I wish I had come to that realization earlier in my life. I told you I think I had coined a new phrase, beneficent selfishness. And I think that describes it. You do a good deed for somebody, whether it's being on a Florida Bar committee, being president of the Florida Bar, help doing some pro bono work, whatever it might be, something that we would generally consider to be a good deed for someone else, giving of yourself, your time, your talents, and maybe even your money for the benefit of somebody else. The reality is, and I truly believe this, I'm not just saying this because we're videoing this, maybe someone will actually listen to it, but I truly believe this. We get so much more out of this by giving, so much more satisfaction. And I'm going to give you a quote because somebody said this really well. And I wrote this down because I thought it was interesting. I'll see if I can find it real quick. But yes, this shows there's nothing new. Just like the old Proverbs. Some years ago, Montague said this with regard to this topic we're talking about by contribution. Quote, there is a sort of gratification in doing good, which makes us rejoice in ourselves. It makes us rejoice in ourselves. I mean, that says it beautifully. And I think that's true. And I don't understand, I wish I had learned this earlier in life. But as Bob said the other day, and I truly believe as well, we do this for other, good reasons. Hopefully not just like say, to get business, get clients, things like that. But we do it because it's the right thing to do. I think human beings have our nature is to do that. I truly believe that. But we get so much back from that. The old saying, it's better to give than to receive. That is so true. So that's why I call it beneficent selfishness, because and Bob used that word selfishness in his comments, and I related to that, because you almost feel selfish that, hey, wait a minute, I'm not feeling good about this. And I'm rejoicing in myself. So I think that is something that people, lawyers in particular, because we have such gifts to give. We have so many platforms in which to be generous with our time and our talents. I mean, there's just so many options and so many opportunities to do that. And we should take advantage of those opportunities. Not only because, we're lawyers, but because we're human beings. So I think that is a very, very important part. Yeah.
I agree with you. And then the last two C's are civility and contentment. Any other thoughts you have about those two C's that you'd like to add as we conclude this?
I want to talk about contentment, because to me, this is the bottom line. Civility, we talk about that ad infinitum. But I don't think too many people focusing on contentment, how we feel about ourselves. Getting up every morning and looking in the mirror and saying, do I like that person in the mirror, or do I have a problem with that person in the mirror? And I think in the context and what we're talking about now, professionalism, if you do things the right way, if you are a competent lawyer, well prepared to go to the courtroom or the closing or whatever it might be, you are treating the opposing side or the other side and the court and the clients and opposing clients with not kindness, with courtesy, with civility, then you are going to be happy with yourself. And to me, that's such a big deal. As I grow older, I realize happiness is a big deal in life. And these are the kind of things that should make us satisfied and happy. I don't mean giggly happy. I'm talking about the contentment, the inner satisfaction you have with yourself. And to me, in life, to a certain extent, giving to others and the contentment that you have about yourself are probably the two most important things you can have. And that is folded into your relationships as well. So those are the things I like to think about. I think about them myself. I'm glad I've had the opportunity to share them. Maybe someone will agree with me.
I believe they will. And so my last question for you, Judge, and I can't begin to thank you enough for you taking the time to share your thoughts with us. It's been absolutely wonderful. My last question for you is, and I think you've answered it, but I want to ask it directly. Do you have faith in the system?
Well, let me respond to your preliminary comments about thank you, Peter. This is a great example of contributing and contentment, because I've gotten much more out of this than you've gotten, and any person who might just stumble on this video somewhere down the line trying to get some CLE credit. I mean, that's an absolute truth there. Okay. Do I have faith in the system? Absolutely yes. As I said earlier on, I think our profession is the best profession. It has its warts, we're human beings. But I think we have enough people who really care about our profession, who want to do the right thing, the great majority. I mean, I tell you, there's nothing I enjoy more. Well, that's probably an overstatement, but I really do enjoy having two good lawyers come into my courtroom and try a case where I don't have to do much. And I sit back and I watch it unfold. And I think to myself, what a pleasure this is to see these kind of people who are so professional, so civil, so well prepared, doing the right thing, going about their job, so to speak, in a way that makes me proud. And one of the great joys of being a judge is at the end of a trial, when the jury walks out, begin the deliberations. If I can turn to the lawyers in the room, and I do this on a number of occasions, probably more occasions than deserve it, on a lot of occasions, I turn to them and say, in front of I always want to say this in front of the clients, because I think the clients should know this, how much I appreciate the way these lawyers have tried the case. They've, first and most important, they've represented their client in the highest fashion, the highest proficiency and competency. And both sides were extremely well represented. But I particularly appreciate, as a sitting judge, the professional way that these lawyers have acted, civilly, well prepared, and make my job so much easier, that it makes me so proud to be a member of our profession. Yes, I have faith in our profession. I really do. We have a few wrinkles here and there, but we're in good shape. We're in good hands. Thank you.
Judge, thank you so much for taking the time with us. I'm grateful to spend this time with you. And again, I wish you and your family the very best, and thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.